Yeah, it's early, George. We made it.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi. Thanks for coming.
So we have like our early voice on. So I'll kick it off. My name is AJ Pashka. I'm currently the station manager for WYCE, and we are in our fall fund drive, so don't forget to call 732-WYC. Plug. But that's part of the Grand Rapids Community Media Center, and sometimes I work with George for upwards of 1 hour sometimes. So they kind of invited me along to kind of lead the conversation through what it is that you've done with the Issue Press. And like Julia was saying, the theme for this month in Creative Mornings was ink. And so they thought of Issue Press. And Issue Press is a little bit different because I was going to start off with like a joke like that my band needed flyers and I needed 10,000 of them by next week or something like that, or I got this really cool project to start a magazine and will you publish it? But in fact, Issue Press has made a name for itself in small press and by using a risograph. And there's probably people in here that don't know what a risograph is, and maybe you can introduce yourself and tell a little bit about a risograph.
Sure. So my name is George, as has been established, and I work in the daytime at Community Media Center with AJ for upwards of an hour, and then at night and then on weekends I do Issue Press, which is primarily a publishing project, meaning that I publish works by other artists and by myself, but I also do a little bit of commercial printing to sort of pay for all of that, because as of yet, publishing is not sustainable on its own, at least for me. So I use primarily a machine called a risograph, or a risograph. It's kind of debatable how you say it. I say risograph, but I've heard it said every possible way. And essentially, a risograph is what's called a digital duplicator, which is also kind of a lame name, that was developed in Japan in the 80s. It's based on mimeograph technology. Is anyone here familiar with the mimeograph? It's the way that copies were made. The heyday was kind of around the 50s before Xerox came into play, but honestly, it's still being used in some parts of the world. This company, Riso Kogaku Corporation in Japan, made these machines. They made mimeographs back when it was appropriate to make a mimeograph, and when copy machines came around, they're like, we're not going to stop. This is great. We got a good thing going here. How can we make a mimeograph look like a copy machine and also function automatically? So essentially, a risograph is an automatic mimeograph. To talk a little bit more about the process, Xerox uses plastic toner. It kind of fuses plastic to paper. That's how that works, which when I first understood that it was plastic, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. But the Riso uses liquid ink, and it also uses a screen master. So essentially what happens is that a screen gets burned by the machine, gets wrapped around a print drum. There's ink inside of the print drum that's being forced out, and then a paper presses up against the drum and leaves an impression. So it's a kind of a weird mix of the archaic and fantastical, because it all happens automatically inside this really boring-looking machine.
But it looks pretty complicated when I see you working, because sometimes I'll follow you on Instagram just to check out what George is doing. But the machine actually looks like there's a lot of moving parts. And is there a large community of people that use them?
Yes, yeah, it's pretty massive actually. For such a Riso Kogaku Corporation is actually a pretty small company itself. I think someone who works there told me there was only like 3,000 people who work there globally, which is sort of insane. But there's many machines, probably in every church in America. That's sort of their primary market in this country is the church market, because they're perfect for those, the two-color church pamphlets that you get every Sunday that you grew up with. or
But it's not something to make a Bible out of.
no, well,
That's a lot. That's a lot of paper.
it's a lot of paper, but I mean, a Bible's going to be a lot of paper anyways.
Yeah, that's true.
It kind of depends on how many you're making. So not to get too far into that, so the logistics
What about
of making
just
a book.
one? Just one.
It's not good for making one. So its sort of sweet spot is over 100 copies, less than 1,000. Under 100 copies, it makes more sense to do it digitally. Over 1,000, it makes way more sense to do it offset. The kind of market that they've built is that 100 to 1,000, which, again, perfect for the church market. So they're churches and hospitals, any place where you have to make a bunch of copies of the same thing, like forms or whatever, but not a million of them. So you see them in military, like all over the place. You've come across material printed on one without having known it. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, and when you said that it's offset, it sounds like it's like a mechanical version of a silkscreen process. Is that a good way to understand kind of how it works?
In some ways, yes. It has the sort of same idea of holes in a screen. So in that regard, and also liquid ink, in that regard, it's very similar. But silkscreening offers a little bit more freedom. You can mix any color. You can do a lot more. You can kind of print on any surface that you can. With the risograph, it's formally very similar, but you're kind of locked into a set color set that is made by the ink manufacturer, and you can only use paper that will pass through the press.
So when did you get your hands on one, and why?
Okay. I got my first one in 2009, I want to say, and I got it from a church here in town on Craigslist, which is a good place to find them. So as Marley mentioned, I was one of the co-founders of the Division Avenue Arts Collective, which is a music venue that used to be across the street. And we were doing, sometimes 20 events a month, sometimes 5 events a month, but we were doing events all the time for about a decade. And so I had a need to make posters all the time, and I got kind of tired of the Xerox aesthetic a little bit, just because I'd been doing it for so long. And then screen printing a little bit, but I don't really have the back for it. And so I started looking for other methods of producing beautiful work that wasn't using either of those two technologies. And a friend of mine who works at a bookstore in Berlin told me about all these really marvelous books that were starting to come into the store made on these machines. And what was happening in Europe was people were taking these kind of everyday commonplace office machines and using them for artistic purposes to really, really marvelous effect. So I started researching presses in Europe, mostly in England and the Netherlands, and just really fell in love with it and started a really manic search to find my own machine. And one just sort of fell into my lap. So about a year after I started looking. And
then when did you decide to start Issue Press and start producing content that you chose?
Yeah, so, it was always content. The difference is in the beginning, it was content that I was sort of making, but as things kind of happened for me pretty regularly, I kind of got really excited about the making and like the physical making of it, and I was kind of, my hands were moving a little bit faster than my head, I guess, and I ended up in this role where I was working with other people to produce work, and that kind of morphed into a curatorial project where I was publishing primarily other people's work, and I now do very little of my own apart from assistive design, just because I'm so consumed with printing for other people's projects.
And when you do print other people's projects, are you building a community, or how are you finding these people that you interact with, and kind of where do the books go from there? Like, how do you meet the person? What's the experience of kind of making something, and then where does it go when you send it out into the world?
Yeah, so I would say about half of the artists that I've published are from Grand Rapids, and that is by default of living here and being exposed to some really, really marvelous artists, some of whom are in the room, which I'm excited to see. And then about half are people that don't live in Grand Rapids, just artists that I really like, some that I wasn't personally familiar with beforehand, and just sort of an email is what initiated it, and some people that I've just always loved and wanted to work with. So
So then, when you meet these people, why is it better that maybe they understand the process of risograph printing, and what's it like to create their work? Or what are some experiences? Because I imagine that there's variations between different people and different projects.
Everyone's different. I would say that you wouldn't have to have that much of a knowledge ahead of time, because that's sort of my role, is to help prepare the art and make it all work appropriately. But it's helpful if you have some kind of concept of screen printing, because the setup is very, very similar. I don't know if there's any one way I could answer that. The relationship with every artist and every project is completely different. I don't, in 25 published titles, and I've probably printed around 200, and everyone has been 200 different versions of weird insanity, particularly when you're working over email with people outside of the state or outside of the country, which I primarily work with now.
And what are some of those titles that you've created? What are some of the different projects that have gone
many of
through?
them are all out and about. Some recent ones that I'm really excited about is one called Ever Your Friend, which is out there somewhere. It's a project by Anna Campbell, who's a professor at Grand Valley and is currently visiting professor at University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's a collection of images abstracted from the Lesbian History Archive in Brooklyn. And it's just a really marvelous collection of images to begin with, and then her work, sort of abstracting them, just kind of pushes it to another interesting level. So I'm really excited in historical work, and this is like the first step.
Yeah, well, speaking of historical work, maybe one of the projects that people have seen that you've helped create is, and maybe just solo created, but if you can elaborate on it, is the Grand Rapids First calendar, because that made it around quite a bit in town here. So what was your role in that?
That was just me. I did the drawings, I did the research, I printed it, and bound it. That was all me. That was
no big deal.
I think that started as primarily both it was like a research project, both researching the historical matter. So basically, it's a calendar where every month is a different thing that happened for the first time in Grand Rapids, and so it was partially doing that historical research, finding things that are unique, of which I found about 14, and 13 are in there. And also doing a little bit of research into copyright too. Like one first that isn't in there is the Calder sculpture, for example, because I called up the people who do the rights for that, and they were not excited. So that was a big component of it, is just sort of going through, doing the legwork to figure out how to do something like that, which was some things I just sort of knew intuitively, but I'd never called up a rights holder before. So it was fun.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about when we were preparing for this presentation is kind of the difference between printing and publishing. And is it the same thing? And where do you kind of fall in line of, are you going to become like Random House, or are you going to become Swift Printing or Allegra or Custom, or is it going to stay small and you'll choose your own projects, and kind of where do you find issue press in that world of print and publishing?
On that list, I guess none of the above. My goal is to stay small and hopefully someday transition to the point where I'm not really printing for other people, because it's incredibly stressful, and more just working on my own projects and then having those sell enough that I can pay my rent and at my studio, not even my house rent. They're like totally separate things. That's why I work at the Community Media Center with you for 1 hour a day. So my goal is to stay pretty small and never be like a Random House, which sounds so crazy. To a degree, I like working by myself. It's a little lonely, but I have, with things like the deck, I was part of a planning project that was, at any point there would be 20 stakeholders that were like trying to navigate through a project, which, as any of you that work in consensus-based projects know how confusing and complicated that is. And so after about 10 years of that sort of organizing, it was really exciting to just do something by myself. but then I'm kind of at the point where I think that's how I started working with other people. It just got so lonely that I needed to at least have an email or something. And now I'm kind of evening out, where I want to work with more people, but also maintain my...
Yeah, because I think there's always been something about you that's in one aspect of your life. You're always building communities and things like that. And I should kind of plug my favorite project of yours, which I think doesn't get the credit, but pre-Facebook, kind of pre-MySpace, you had a website called GRAD, and specifically on GRAD, which was kind of like a community forum, there was a group arts calendar. And that was the first time that all the different kind of social cliques and creative circles started basically, instead of sharing their flyers physically in a location, they started looking online for that. And I really think it broke down a lot of the walls of the community. And I think when you went into the risograph, you probably found problems looking for other people that had the same problems as you. Of where do I find this part? How do I fix it? And were you able to kind of take that same motif of creating a community or solving a problem into the risograph community? You know where I'm leading with this?
Yeah, sort of yes and no. So the community of people using these machines for arts making exists, but it's pretty small. There are probably a couple hundred around the world, which sounds like a lot, but when you think about how big the world is, it's not that huge. Amongst that group of a couple hundred, I think there is a lot of camaraderie and communication. There's this really marvelous secret mailing list that many of us are on, where we can share information like that. And then a more public-facing thing is this project called stencil.wiki, which is a wiki project that I initiated to both map people using the risographs for arts making purpose, and then also share some really basic tutorials for how to do repairs and things along those lines. These machines are really, really marvelous, and they last a long time, but by the time they get to the point where artists can afford them, they've been really put through the ringer by their original owners. I can't think of any, like I think the MCA in Chicago has a new one, like those kind of institutions have new ones for art making purposes, but the average person like myself got theirs used on Craigslist after it had been basically destroyed. So you spend a lot of time repairing them. And there aren't a lot of resources. There's one incredible forum, and now this mailing list, and then slowly building up a tutorial base about doing repairs and basic setup. There's also things like comprehensive color list, which Riso sort of has themselves, but it's not very useful. It's more for like, oh, I pick that color to order ink from them, not like this is the approximate Pantone and things that a designer would need to work with the colors that they have. So as a community, we're kind of building up those resources for ourselves.
And have you met other people through this community?
Loads and loads and loads.
Yeah. How and where?
On the internet, and then eventually in person. The sort of two big things are, one is sort of a concept, which is the concept of a book fair. There are these things that happen a couple times a year called the art book fairs, which are basically massive conventions, I guess, for people who do similar work to what I do. The two biggest ones in America are the New York Art Book Fair and the LA Art Book Fair, which are both put on by a bookstore called Printed Matter, which is the biggest sort of publisher, or not publisher, they publish stuff too, but they're the biggest bookstore for this type of printed matter, which is artist-initiated book projects, or books as art projects. And so there's a lot of community built around those events. Also comic book conventions, like indie comic conventions, because a lot of the really exciting stuff in North America regarding Riso printing is happening in the comic sphere. I would say even more so than the art book fair. And then there is a new event that is being spearheaded by the Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands, which is sort of a biannual meetup of Riso printers, the first of which was held last year, and I was really delighted to get to go and speak at it. It was pretty exciting.
So you were able to travel to Europe, and what was it like kind of going in comparison to the exciting comic books and things like that being made here in America? What was going on in Europe, and what was the things that they were discussing?
Europe definitely has the comic thing going, but it's the minority. They're sort of flipped. There, the Rezo community is very, very art and design focused, with some people doing comics. And here, it's really comics focused, with some people doing art and design.
Cool. And so how do people buy the things that you've made? We talked little bit about print and matter. We have companies, so that's great. And where are some of the other places that your work is gone, physically gone?
Yeah, sure. There's a handful of bookstores around the country, like Printed Matter in New York, and Quimby's in Chicago, and Art Metropole in Toronto. And I'm excited to say, as of that trip, that original bookstore that got me excited about Rezo now has a few of my titles. So mostly bookstores, really small arts-focused bookstores, and then also online.
And so who are some of the people that are inspiring you, both in the field or people that you want to work with Issue Press itself? But who are you looking towards for maybe inspiration or deep questions?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of, like some of my favorite printers out there is, again, the Jan van Eyck Academy. The guy there, Jo Franken, was a long-time sort of master printing in a traditional printing landscape, like using letterpress and etching and silk screening. But that academy has basically gotten rid of all that stuff and replaced it all with a risograph, and so he's applying this sort of master printing techniques and knowledge to the Rezo, doing some really, really incredible stuff. And they've slowly kind of rebuilt their traditional printing lab too, but yeah, I think that they're really incredible. The first people who really actively use the Rezo for art making is this group called Knoest, also in the Netherlands. And Knoest is, they're the Dutch masters of Rezo printing. Yeah, they're pretty incredible. There's a couple of newer publishers in Asia that I'm really excited about, OO.oo and Nos. Nos isn't newer, they're older than I am, but I just found out about them, so they're new to me. Both in Taiwan, and Corners in Korea, a bunch in Canada, including Color Code. Yeah. I mean, I could just list, there's so many that I love. Yeah, but I don't know if this is interesting to just list names. But
it is interesting that a lot of the inspiration, it's a worldwide phenomena. It's not like you met somebody in town here, or they're coming from Indiana, Ohio, or the tri-state region or anything like that. You're looking all over the world. So what you're doing kind of has a global aspect to it.
I'm as likely or more likely to get advice from somebody in Norway than I am in Michigan. Probably more likely, actually.
And it seems like the risograph has gone really trendy and has become a fad. And there's some projects out there. It's like, I'm not sure if Kanye West is doing like a zine or something like that. There was something really large. And do you think that it's gotten too trendy, or if you can get like a risograph like at Urban Outfitters or something like that?
You can't buy one there, but I know their design team has had one for several years. So kinda?
Yeah, kind of. But do you think that large kind of product aspect of it is new, or is it going to last? Or
I feel like in general, the more of a user base for art and design, the better, because then there'll be more people sharing information about it. Also, the market will be a little bit better for... My big concern with Rezo is that they're always going to just... I don't think they'll disappear, but they've moved on to other technologies, and I'm always afraid they're going to cut the ink production or something. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but in North America, you've seen it get really, really boring, the ink options, whereas in Europe, they're really exciting. It's easy to get fluorescent orange and things that are kind of difficult and really complicated to get here. and that's just because of the difference in the market. I think here it's what church is going to use fluorescent orange, but
The cool one.
Adobe's Design Lab having a Riso, even Facebook's Design Lab has one now. Like those types of more people using them for art in this market, I think, will make a better case to Riso, the corporation, to make the offerings a little bit more exciting. So in general, I'm really happy about more people using it. As far as the fad stuff, I think that, yeah, it's definitely at the, in my mind, it's like at the peak and about to go down. But what that means is I think that there's a lot of stuff being produced on it that maybe isn't appropriate and is only being produced on it because it seems like a cool idea to do, but doesn't really fit the medium too well. So the only problem to me about sort of fad thing is that maybe a lot of things are just kind of being shoehorned into it, whereas it does take a lot of thought to actually prepare a project for it. And
yeah, because you can do different things where maybe a lot of designers are thinking about the different color modes that they're in, like RGB, RYB, CMYK, but Riso, you're able to bust out of just CMYK, right?
There is no CMYK. That's one thing I didn't mention about it before, is that one of the things that's both challenging and really freeing is that there's no CMYK. It's all spot color. So you're in those books, anything that appears to be photo reproduction is using radically different colors than you would traditionally see in a full color thing. Like one of them is just orange and purple, for example. But you can, if you do enough experimenting, you can actually get a lot of browns, but also a lot of value from orange and purple. So one of the things that to me is the most exciting is sort of troubleshooting how to work with a really locked in and tight palette and make it, I don't know, really exciting.
Yeah, it makes it a lot different. So when, in that aspect of the fad of Riso, maybe a lot of projects are coming on with people thinking about CMYK and just doing traditional matter, but then they choose a risograph and not using what's really interesting about the machine and what it can do. So they're not really fulfilling the total opportunity that it offers.
Yeah, the CMYK is an increasingly popular area because it's also part of the fun, at least from a technical standpoint, is getting it as close to CMYK as possible without using CMYK ink. So it's sort of like a weird dragon you're chasing to like get it perfect.
Yeah.
To use a weird drug analogy. CMYK as on the Riso does have its place because it's interesting to do from technically, I guess, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, and maybe to continue, if there's people out there that have had questions and want to chase the dragon of the answer down to George, maybe we can open it up to some questions from the audience.
Another quick thing about limitations, and maybe I didn't focus this enough. One of the things about Riso, to me, that is exciting, is how limited it is. The largest sheet of paper you can print on is 11 by 17, so you have to work with that limitation. For each color, you need to have a dedicated ink drum, so once you decide to have a color, you are locked into that color. Well, you can change it, but it takes some time. You can't just go from, it would be impractical to do one thing with red and then convert that to blue and then do the next thing with blue. You need to have a red drum and a blue drum. So there's a lot to having multiple colors.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but if you can kind of imagine it. I think there's a picture, I can't see the slides, but I think there's a picture that shows like, there's one machine that has there's a couple models that have 2 ink drums, there's a couple that have, most have 1. They both have their challenges and perks.
Yeah, and one of the things about restrictions is sometimes that aids in the creativity.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm most excited about. That sort of, trying to replicate CMYK and non-CMYK, the limitations are what makes it exciting.
Yeah. Are there questions out there for George? Julie?
So you talked a bit about how you worked, printing for concerts for 10 years, doing events all the time, and then wanted to get you kind of started to do your own thing, have your own press. That for Issue Press started. I'm curious, and now it sounds that niche of being like the production and design like assistant expert of like making that artifact, or do you miss coming up with the initial idea?
Oh yeah, I miss it a lot. But right now, with just the practicality of running the studio doesn't really allow for it. I have to spend all of my free time doing commercial work, which I'm lucky, and one thing that's been lucky about Rezo is that 90% of the projects that people ask you to do are really exciting and really cool. So it's not boring in that regard, but I would like to have to do less of that and, again, produce more of my own work. But it just, I've got 6 hours after work every day. I don't have enough time to do that and also design work. So, yeah, I end up just sort of applying my skills to making other people's project work. Sometimes, though, someone will just hand me, like particularly artists that I am working with will just give me the raw piece of paper that they drew, and then I then get the pleasure of doing the entire book layout based on that. And I really like doing that, but I also love working with artists who know what they're doing and kind of hand me a package thing. So they're both fun.
I was wondering if you, you talked a lot about your creative success and like the technical successes and stuff, but I'm more curious about like not more curious, but also curious about sort of like the financial side of it. So like
There's no success.
But like, have you done a second edition because something sold well, or like when you travel to a zine show or something, are you just breaking even, or?
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason to go is that social aspect. I get to meet a lot of other printers. I get to meet lots of artists in person that I wouldn't meet because less of them are traveling here and none of them are based here. So that sort of, I'm not excited about schmoozing at all, but that sort of, I don't want to say networking, but just meeting other people that I love, like their work, is maybe the most rewarding thing about participating in book fairs and zine fairs. I would say at best they break even or make a little bit. Like when you consider like flights and stuff like that, it's kind of hard to make up for a flight selling a $10 book that is marked up $2 or whatever. So yeah, the other issue too is I'm really passionate about books, and that will never be not the main focus, but they're a lot harder to make, and they're a lot harder to, they're just a lot more work, and they take a lot more resources than print, but most people seem willing to buy a print for more money than a book that takes like 20 times more work and costs so much more to make. So that is sort of like a weird, I like prints just as much as the next person, but I also really like books. And so my own sort of, I'm going to run myself into the ground just making books, I think.
Well, I guess like a follow-up question would be like, do you keep track of the hours and the material costs and stuff, or is it just fast and loose?
I keep track of the material costs. I don't track my hours because it would get really depressing.
And maybe I could flip that question into something that I've taken from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. But we have a lot of people here. Are there things that you need to be successful? Are you looking for studio space, or what are you looking for?
I was, but I got that worked out. I don't know. Anybody have any old machines they want to get rid of? I'm at a point right now where the difference between, like, I use sort of scrapbooking as an example. Like, you can go to Meyer and get a, this is not a good analogy, so I'm going to back out. Well, actually, no, I'll go down that same path. You can go to Meyer and get like a corner rounder for, like $10 or something like that. That's great for rounding one page at a time. But if you want to round an entire book at a time, you're getting into hundreds and thousands of dollars. There's kind of no in between like scrapbooking, mass market, and production. So like deciding to go from one to the next has been a complicated
Yeah.
leap. So I end up doing a lot of work that is not very similar, not dissimilar from the way that I made zines 15 years ago. Just I'm having to do a lot more of them, manually folding paper and stapling it together and stuff. So I would like to get more. There are machines that you put down a piece of paper and a book comes out the other side.
Right.
Which, I would kind of miss the handwork. I get to catch up on X-Files and stuff like that. But yeah, it would be nice to somehow find a way to make that leap into more professional equipment.
Is there, as you've been doing this, is there certain things that you, like subject matter, that you'd like to print about, or something that since you started doing this, that you discovered that you like printing more about, or just topics that you kind of hover around?
Not specific topics or ironically issues, but I find myself really attracted to mediums, I guess. I learned that I love illustration a lot more than I understood before I started doing this project, which has been great because I don't think that I ever really considered it before I started really actively making books, but it's kind of turned into my favorite thing. I guess less topics and more mediums. I'm really interested in everything. I think that maybe that's why I like books to begin with, because there's books about everything.
David,